The most expensive rooms in Manhattan are often where people say the cheapest things. On the 39th floor of a glass tower overlooking Park Avenue, the divorce conference room was cold in a way that had nothing to do with the air conditioning and everything to do with the man sitting at the far end of the polished table. Bennett-Cross wore a charcoal suit cut so perfectly it seemed designed to remind the world that wealth could smooth every edge except the soul. White, handsome, and controlled in the exact way powerful men were taught to be, he sat beneath recessed lighting with one hand resting near a Mont Blanc pen and the other draped over the leather arm of his chair, as if the ending of a marriage were simply another document waiting for his signature. Across from him, Ava Bennett-Cross sat very still in a black coat over a cream blouse, her hair pulled back, her warm brown skin catching the sterile light with a softness the room did not deserve. She had once believed stillness could protect love, that grace would be rewarded, that being patient with a man's ambition might one day make him gentle. Now she understood something else. Stillness did not always mean peace. Sometimes it was the exact moment a woman stopped reaching for what had already let her go. The attorney on Damien's side cleared his throat and slid the final page across the table. Papers whispered. A clock ticked somewhere behind frosted glass. Far below, the city roared on, indifferent and alive. Ava signed first. Her hand did not tremble. That seemed to irritate Damien more than tears would have. He picked up the pen, glanced at her once, and signed his own name with the detached confidence of a man who believed endings proved his power instead of exposing his poverty. Then he leaned back, let out a slow breath, and delivered the line that would follow her for years. "Let us be honest, Ava," he said, almost kindly, which made it crueler. "Women like you survive by holding on to men like me." The room did not move. The attorneys looked down. Even the city outside seemed to recede for one suspended second. Ava lifted her eyes to him, and what Damien mistook for hurt was something far more dangerous. Clarity. She saw him then with a clean, merciless focus she had never allowed herself before. Not as the brilliant billionaire founder, not as the husband whose name opened doors, not as the man whose approval had once made her feel chosen, but as someone so convinced of his own importance that he had mistaken access for authorship. He thought his money had built her life because he had never bothered to learn what she carried into every room before he arrived. She did not argue. She did not defend herself. She simply closed the folder, rose from the chair, and gathered the small leather bag beside her feet. The attorney opened the conference room door. Cold light spilled in from the hallway. Damien watched her as though silence confirmed his theory, as though a woman leaving without protest was the same thing as a woman broken. But as Ava stepped past him, there was no defeat in her face. Only the terrible calm of someone who had finally heard the truth clearly enough to stop begging it to become something else. Minutes later, she emerged onto the Manhattan sidewalk beneath a sky the color of steel. Rain began in a fine silver mist, catching in her hair, darkening the shoulders of her coat, softening the hard glitter of the avenue around her. Taxis hissed past. Umbrellas opened like black flowers. Ava stood there for one breath with the signed papers in her bag and Damien's sentence still burning in the air behind her, and then she walked into the rain without looking back, leaving him with the illusion of victory and herself with the first clean step of a life he would never again be able to define. The rain followed Ava 3 blocks north before she finally stopped beneath the narrow green awning of a hotel cafe she could not afford to enter and did not need to. Water slid from the edge of her coat, gathered at her cuffs, and darkened the leather strap of the bag carrying the signed papers that had just ended one life and left the next one unnamed. Traffic moved in silver streaks along Park Avenue. Men in navy overcoats hurried by with coffee and confidence. Women in heels stepped around puddles with phones pressed to their ears. No one looked at her twice, and for the first time in years, invisibility did not feel like a wound. It felt like room. Ava stood there breathing in the wet metallic scent of the city until the worst of the shaking passed through her. Damien's sentence remained inside her, sharp and polished, but something about hearing it spoken aloud had stripped it of power. He had not cursed her. He had not shouted. He had simply revealed the architecture of his contempt, and truth, once exposed, was strangely easier to survive than confusion. She reached into her bag, silenced 2 calls from an unknown number she knew belonged to Damien's assistant, and opened the Notes app on her phone instead. For a long second the screen stayed blank. Then she typed one sentence. He was wrong about the source. She stared at the words as rain ticked softly against the awning above her. And in that small act of writing, something within her shifted from grief to record. She was not ready to call it determination yet. Determination sounded too clean for a woman whose marriage had just been folded into legal stationery. But she knew this much. She would not spend the next year proving she had been lovable. She would spend it learning what remained when his definition of her no longer occupied the room. By evening, she was in a furnished sublet on the Upper West Side, the kind rented by the month to people between versions of themselves. The apartment was narrow and beige and faintly smelled of radiator heat and someone else's lavender detergent. A twin lamp cast weak yellow light over a kitchenette, a small desk, and a window facing a brick wall close enough to erase the illusion of a view. Ava set her bag on the chair, hung her damp coat over the shower rod, and sat on the edge of the bed without taking off her shoes. In the penthouse she had once shared with Damien, everything had been oversized, curated, designed to suggest permanence. Here there was a chipped mug in the cabinet, a blanket folded at the foot of the bed, and a silence that belonged entirely to her. She opened the folder from the divorce table one last time, not to reread the terms, but to remove her old business cards from the inside pocket. Ava Bennett-Cross, philanthropy advisor. She held the card between two fingers, then turned it over and wrote on the blank back, strategy, capital, brand recovery. The words looked almost absurd in her own handwriting, like a future she had no right to imagine yet. Still, she kept writing. Industries she understood. Rooms she could read. People she had watched Damien underestimate until they became useful to him. By midnight the card was covered edge to edge in small, precise notes. Outside, the rain had stopped. Somewhere in the building a door closed, then another. Ava stood, crossed to the mirror above the dresser, and looked at the woman in the dim yellow light. Her face was tired. Her eyes were swollen at the edges. But beneath the wreckage there was something Damien had never recognized because he had never gone looking for it. She did not look abandoned. She looked interrupted. And interruption, she understood now, was not the same thing as ending. The first year did not look anything like revenge. It looked like fluorescent grocery store light at 9:30 at night, a second-hand coat drying over a radiator, and Ava bent over a library table with a stack of finance textbooks she could not afford to misunderstand. She left the Upper West Side sublet after 3 months and moved into a smaller walk-up in Brooklyn with narrow stairs, cracked tile in the kitchen, and a window that framed more brick than sky. But the rent was lower and the silence was cleaner. By day, she took contract work no one glamorous would have noticed, ghostwriting donor communications for a nonprofit that kept running out of momentum, reorganizing messaging for a beauty startup run by two exhausted sisters, reviewing decks for founders who had vision but no language sharp enough to make investors believe it. By night, she studied accounting, brand positioning, distressed assets, private equity structures, the hidden grammar of money Damien had always spoken as if it were native only to men like him. Sometimes she fell asleep over a spreadsheet with her cheek against legal paper and woke at dawn with columns of numbers imprinted faintly into her skin. But she kept going because she had discovered something in those cold, ordinary months that felt almost holy in its practicality. She was not starting from nothing. She was starting from everything he had failed to see. Damien, meanwhile, kept expanding. His name appeared in business journals beside glossy portraits and phrases like strategic genius and market instinct, and once, standing in line for coffee, Ava saw his face on a magazine cover and felt nothing dramatic at all. No sharp heartbreak, no trembling, only distance, as if she were looking at a country she no longer lived in. That frightened her more than pain would have, because it meant she was changing in ways even she had not measured yet. The first real turning point came 18 months after the divorce when a founder named Lena Moore called at nearly midnight in tears because the ethical fashion company she had built was about to collapse under debt, bad press, and one investor who wanted to strip it for parts and call it leadership. Ava listened for 40 minutes without interrupting. Then she asked 5 questions so precise that Lena stopped crying long enough to answer them. 2 weeks later, Ava flew coach to Chicago with one carry-on bag, a navy notebook, and a plan written in clean black ink. She restructured the narrative first, then the internal flow, then the capital conversation. She cut what was decorative, protected what was true, and taught Lena how to enter rooms without apologizing for needing them. The company did not just survive. It returned. Smaller, sharper, profitable. 3 months after that, another client came through referral. Then another. Ava stopped writing strategy notes on the backs of old business cards and began using cream stationery embossed only with her initials. She opened a private bank account large enough to stop counting every subway fare. She bought one excellent coat instead of 3 cheap ones. She learned the power of arriving 5 minutes late to meetings in order to control the temperature of the room. Her voice grew quieter. Her instincts grew colder. Not crueler. Just less available to men who mistook warmth for ownership. Years passed this way, not in montage, but in disciplined accumulation. By the time her firm had a waiting list and a discreet office behind frosted glass in Tribeca, Ava no longer looked like a woman rebuilding after loss. She looked like someone who had turned loss into infrastructure. And somewhere inside that slow, meticulous rise, Damien's sentence stopped sounding like prophecy and started sounding like proof that the one thing he had never understood was the scale of the woman he had dismissed. By the 5th year, Ava's success no longer arrived as a rumor passed through other people's mouths. It had weight now. Structure. Receipts. Her office occupied the 12th floor of a limestone building in Tribeca with frosted glass doors, pale oak floors, and the kind of silence that made powerful people lower their voices when they entered. There was no gold logo screaming for attention, no photographs of her with celebrities, no sentimental language framed on the walls. Just clean lines, warm light, and a brass plate outside the conference room that read Bennett Advisory in small black lettering. Clients came because she could see the fracture in a brand before anyone else admitted it was there. Investors came because she understood that money did not save a collapsing company unless someone first restored its narrative, its discipline, and the dignity of the people inside it. She had built a reputation for stepping into failing empires without becoming emotionally attached to any of them. That, more than the money, was what changed her. The younger version of Ava had once entered rooms hoping to be understood. This version entered already knowing exactly what she was worth, and that certainty made warmth selective. She still laughed, still sent flowers when a client lost a parent, still remembered the names of assistants and drivers, and the woman who kept the espresso machine running in the lobby downstairs. But the softness Damien had mistaken for dependency was no longer available to men who led with charm and expected access to follow. Her money changed quietly, the way truly secure wealth often does. First came the black Amex no one ever saw her use carelessly. Then a 2-bedroom loft in Tribeca purchased under her own name, all steel-framed windows, creamstone counters, museum-white walls, and a view of lower Manhattan that looked less like conquest and more like perspective. She bought art from young black women painters before the galleries tripled their prices. She kept her closet narrow and exact. Cashmere, silk, one exceptional camel coat, one watch so understated only people who actually understood power recognized it on sight. Nothing about her life shouted rich. It simply refused to explain itself. Damien continued expanding his holdings in the years she was becoming someone else entirely. He appeared on panels, in interviews, in those glossy quarterly profiles that asked men like him about vision while quietly ignoring the women who had once taught them how rooms worked. Once or twice Ava saw his name attached to acquisitions she could have made more elegant and more profitable, and all she felt was the detached assessment of a strategist studying a familiar weakness. He still moved too fast when he thought dominance could substitute for patience. He still mistook scale for inevitability. Late one winter evening, after a private dinner with a client from London, Ava stood alone in her kitchen with a crystal tumbler of sparkling water and watched snow gather in soft white bands against the dark glass. Her phone lit with an invitation forwarded by her assistant, a black-tie philanthropic gala the following month, one she had already been asked to keynote. Beneath the formal language and sponsorship list was a name she had not spoken aloud in years. Damien Cross, principal donor. Ava read it once, set the phone down, and looked at her reflection in the window. The woman staring back at her was richer, yes, but not only in money. She was richer in restraint, in judgment, in the kind of emotional solvency that no longer panicked when the past appeared at the edge of a future she had built herself. She touched the stem of the water glass, calm as winter, and understood that if she walked into that room, it would not be to reopen anything. It would be to stand in the life he once thought impossible for her, and let the truth do what it had always done best when given enough time. Turn cold, become valuable, and stop asking to be touched. Damien did not think about Ava often enough to call it obsession, but often enough to call it unfinished. In the years since the divorce, he had trained himself to translate every mention of her into something smaller, a lucky break, a well-timed pivot, a woman with discipline and taste who had happened to survive the wreckage better than expected. That was the story he preferred because it left his own judgment intact. It allowed him to believe that whatever Ava had become was impressive only within limits he still understood. The invitation to the gala cracked that story before the evening had even begun. He was standing in the boardroom of the Cross Foundation on the 22nd floor, one hand around an espresso cup gone cold, while the event's director reviewed the final program with the casual efficiency of a woman who had no idea she was about to disturb the architecture of his certainty. We have the opening remarks, then the donor acknowledgement, then the keynote from Ava Bennett-Cross before the Capital Initiative presentation, she said, turning a page. Damien's hand stopped halfway to the table. The room did not notice at first. Trustees kept reading their packets. A board chair asked about sponsorship placement. Someone mentioned press seating. But Damien heard only the name. Not Mrs. Cross. Not Ava in the softened, private way memory sometimes offered her back to him. Ava Bennett-Cross, spoken into the room like a title earned in public. He lifted his eyes slowly. Who approved that, he asked. The event's director looked up, surprised by the edge in his voice. The programming committee. Unanimously. She smiled, unaware that her answer had landed like a quiet insult. She was the obvious choice. Half the city has been trying to get her on stage this year. Half the city. Damien leaned back in his chair and said nothing after that, because saying too much would have exposed more than irritation. It would have exposed ignorance, and men like him were trained to protect ignorance by disguising it as skepticism. Later that afternoon, he stood alone in his office with the skyline burned gold behind him and opened Ava's latest profile on a financial site he trusted enough to respect. Founder of Bennett Advisory. Specialist in high-risk brand recovery and private strategic restructuring. Quietly influential. Selectively unavailable. The language irritated him because it sounded like the polished mythology New York loved to build around difficult women once they became too successful to dismiss. Yet beneath the irritation, there was something far less comfortable. Recognition. He could hear her in the precision of the phrasing, feel her in the refusal to over-explain. Selectively unavailable. He read that line twice. By evening, the ballroom at the Pierre was already being transformed under ladders, soft lighting grids, and white floral installations when Damien arrived for the final donor walkthrough. He wore a navy overcoat over his suit and carried himself with the same expensive calm that had once convinced whole rooms he was the axis around which outcomes turned. But as he crossed the half-lit ballroom, he heard the stage manager testing the microphone with a dry rehearsal voice. And now, please welcome our keynote guest, founder of Bennett Advisory and one of the most influential private strategists in the city, Ava Bennett-Cross. The name floated through the empty room and struck him harder there than it would have in front of a crowd. Perhaps because empty rooms did not offer applause to hide behind. Damien stopped beneath the chandelier rigging and looked up at the stage where her name glowed temporarily on a rehearsal screen in clean white letters against black. For the first time since the divorce, he understood that he was not walking into an event he funded. He was walking into a room where Ava had become the name people were waiting to hear. On the night of the gala, Manhattan wore winter like polished armor, all black glass, white breath, and headlights smearing gold across wet stone as black cars lined the curb outside the Pierre. Inside, the ballroom glowed with the disciplined beauty of old New York money, cream silk walls, white orchids rising from mirrored tables, candlelight multiplying itself in crystal until the entire room seemed built from reflection and restraint. Damien moved through it in a black tuxedo with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being noticed before he spoke, shaking hands, accepting greetings, answering remarks about the markets and the foundation with the same measured charm that had carried him through rooms like this for years. But beneath the surface of every exchange was a new and unwelcome awareness. The evening no longer belonged to his donation, his table, or his name on the program. It had been tilted towards someone else before the first course was even served. He felt it in the way people kept glancing toward the entrance between conversations, in the low-energy gathering just outside the ballroom doors, in the event staff moving with that particular alertness reserved for the arrival of the person everyone had actually come to see. When the house lights softened and the quartet near the stage let the final violin note dissolve into the room, an expectant hush settled over the tables. Damien turned instinctively toward the entrance at the same moment half the ballroom did. Then Ava walked in. Not rushed, not dramatic. She entered with the deliberate calm of a woman who no longer confused visibility with permission. Her gown was black, severe in its simplicity, cut so cleanly it seemed to absorb light, before returning it in a quieter form. A single line of diamonds lay cool against her throat, and smaller stones flashed once at her ears when she turned her head to greet the board chair, who stepped forward to receive her. Her hair was swept back. Her expression was composed beyond elegance, colder than beauty, not cruel, never that, but untouched by the need to soften herself for anyone in the room. Damien felt the recognition of her before he fully trusted his own eyes. It was not only that she looked richer, though she did, and not in the obvious ways he had once valued. It was that money now seemed to move around her rather than define her. Position moved around her. Attention moved around her. Conversations thinned and redirected as if the room had discovered a more truthful center of gravity. Trustees rose from their tables to greet her. Two women from the private equity panel he had spoken with earlier crossed the room without apology to introduce themselves. A foundation president whose calls had once been nearly impossible to secure was already smiling, as though Ava were the most important alliance of the year. Damien remained still near the center aisle while the evening recalibrated in front of him, and for one strange second, he understood what other people must have felt in his presence all these years, that slight dislocation when the room obeys someone else's weather. Ava's gaze traveled once across the ballroom, taking inventory with the ease of someone trained by years of high-stakes rooms to miss nothing. When her eyes found Damien, she did not start, did not harden, did not offer even the smallest visible reaction. That was the most devastating part. He was no longer an impact. He was information. She inclined her head almost imperceptibly, the sort of acknowledgement one might give a figure from an earlier life already filed and closed, then turned to the stage as the host stepped to the microphone and the applause began. Damien looked at the woman he had once reduced to dependency and realized the coldness he sensed in her was not punishment. It was insulation, expensive and earned, the kind built only after a person learns exactly how much of themselves the world is willing to touch if they do not first set the price. The applause rose not like flattery, but like recognition arriving on time after years of being delayed, and Damien felt its force in a place pride could not easily protect. Ava moved toward the stage with the kind of calm that made movement look effortless even when the entire room had shifted to follow it. The host greeted her with both hands, smiling in that open, deferential way reserved for people whose value no longer required explanation. And when Ava stepped beneath the warm lights of the Pierre ballroom, the black of her gown turned almost liquid against the gold glow behind her. Her name appeared on the screen in clean white lettering. Ava Bennett-Cross, founder, investor, private strategist, and the room responded with another wave of applause that made Damien's chest tighten for reasons he could not reduce to surprise. He had once thought he understood what wealth looked like on a person. Cars, views, watches, invitations. But standing there with a champagne glass untouched in his hand, he began to recognize a more unsettling kind of richness, the kind that settled into posture, silence, and timing. Ava did not look like someone showing the world what she had won. She looked like someone who no longer needed the world's permission to keep it. The board chair introduced her work in careful detail, speaking of failing firms restored without spectacle, of fragile institutions made solvent again under her guidance, of private clients who trusted her because she never confused visibility with value. Each phrase landed with an almost clinical precision against Damien's memory of the woman who had once sat across from him in a divorce room, while he explained her future back to her like a fact. Around him, The ballroom had fully turned. Men who once would have waited for Damien to move first were now leaning toward the stage, listening. Women at the front tables exchanged glances of genuine admiration instead of social politeness. An older investor Damien knew well, a man who rarely praised anyone without strategic motive, nodded slowly through the introduction as if confirming something he had already begun to suspect. The room was not simply impressed by Ava. It had recalibrated around her. When she finally reached the lectern, she placed one hand lightly against its edge and waited for the applause to settle on its own. No rushing, no theatrical smile, just stillness. Then she began to speak. Her voice was low, controlled, and impossibly clear, the kind of voice people leaned toward because it assumed they were intelligent enough to follow without being entertained. She spoke about restoration, about how the market often rewarded noise while real value was being built quietly in overlooked rooms. She spoke about discipline, about the difference between rescue and restructuring, about how some brands failed not because they lacked money, but because they had lost the courage to tell the truth about who they were. Damien listened as if he were hearing the private evolution of her mind spoken aloud for the first time, and with every measured sentence he understood more sharply what had changed in her. The warmth she once offered so freely had not vanished. It had been refined, guarded, made expensive. She was colder because she had learned the cost of being accessible to people who mistook kindness for dependency. She was richer because she had built something no one could repossess with legal paper or contempt. And she was untouchable because the part of her that once reached toward Damien for recognition had long since died and been replaced by something far more formidable. A woman who could stand in the center of a room he funded, address an audience that once would have followed his lead, and make him feel for the first time like a man whose money had purchased many things except the right to matter to her anymore. When the applause finally began to settle, it did not leave the room all at once. It lingered in the chandeliers, in the lifted faces around the tables, in the softened posture of people who had just witnessed power redefined without a single raised voice. Ava stepped away from the lectern with the same measured calm she had brought to it, accepting a brief embrace from the board chair, a handshake from an investor, a quiet word from a woman near the front row who looked almost moved to tears by what had just been said. Damien remained standing near the center aisle with his glass untouched, watching the crowd form around her in a way that was neither chaotic nor desperate. It was orderly, intentional, earned. That was what unsettled him most. Nothing about Ava's return felt accidental. Nothing about it could be dismissed as luck or timing or the generosity of people who liked to rehabilitate a compelling woman after a difficult marriage. This had been built, layer by layer, year by year, silence by silence. By the time she stepped down from the stage, the music had resumed at a low volume, and the room had begun rearranging itself around dinner service, but Damien no longer cared about the sequence of the evening. He cared only about the narrowing distance between himself and the woman he had once mistaken for a dependent extension of his own life. He moved before caution could make him look away again. Ava had just reached the side corridor beyond the ballroom, where the light turned softer and the noise of the room thinned into a distant golden hum, when his voice caught up with her. "Ava." She stopped, but she did not turn immediately. When she did, it was without tension, without surprise, as if she had expected this eventually, just not enough to prepare for it emotionally. She stood with one hand resting lightly against the small black clutch at her side, her expression composed, her eyes unreadable in the low light. Damien felt, with sudden humiliating clarity, that he had approached countless powerful people in his life without ever feeling as uncertain as he did in front of her now. "I only need a minute," he said. The phrase sounded weak the moment it left him, too close to all the ways powerful men asked for access after spending years denying it to others. Ava did not rescue him from that discomfort. "Then use it carefully," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the kind of control that made every word feel chosen twice. Damien exhaled once and looked at her fully, not the memory of her, not the woman in the divorce room, not the outline he had preserved because it made him feel larger, but the person in front of him now. "I did not understand you," he said. "Not your mind, not your discipline, not what you were capable of becoming." Ava held his gaze without softening. "Becoming?" she asked. There was no hostility in the word. That made it sharper. Damien swallowed. You know what I mean. I do, she said. That is the problem. The corridor fell still between them. Somewhere inside the ballroom, silverware touched porcelain, and a burst of polite laughter rose and faded again. Damien stepped no closer. He had finally learned that distance could tell the truth better than touch. I was arrogant, he said. I thought because I had power, I was the reason things around me worked. I thought I was the scale by which everyone else had to be measured. Ava looked at him, then the way one might look at a sentence already underlined in an old book. You were wrong, she said. But not in the way you think. You were not wrong because I changed. You were wrong because you never looked carefully enough at who I already was. He closed his eyes for one brief second, because that landed deeper than any accusation could have. When he opened them, Ava was still standing there, elegant and still, and impossibly far from the woman he once believed he could define. He understood then that her coldness was not cruelty. It was closure, expensive and absolute, and he was standing on the wrong side of it. For a moment after Ava said the words, neither of them moved. The corridor outside the ballroom held that strange hush expensive hotels were built to protect, the softened clink of silver, the low drift of strings from somewhere beyond the doors, the muted traffic of staff who knew how to disappear when something private had become too important to interrupt. Damien stood with his hands at his sides, not because he had run out of things to say, but because he had finally understood that saying more would not change the truth standing in front of him. Ava did not look angry. That would have made the moment easier, would have given him something dramatic to answer, some wound he could still pretend he had the power to soothe. What she wore instead was far more final. Peace. The kind bought slowly, with loneliness, discipline, and years he had once assumed would break her before they built her. I am sorry, he said at last, and this time the words sounded smaller, stripped of polish, almost human in their insufficiency. Ava inclined her head slightly, not in acceptance, not in dismissal, but in acknowledgement of a fact too late to negotiate. I know, she said. Her voice was gentle enough to hurt. That is why I do not need anything else from you. Behind her, the ballroom doors opened. Briefly, and a wash of gold light spilled into the corridor. Someone called her name from inside, a board member asking if she was ready for photographs with the major donors. Ava glanced toward the light, then back at Damien, and in that brief turn of her face, he saw the whole shape of what he had lost. Not only the marriage, not only the woman, the future version of himself that might have existed if he had recognized her before the world taught him how expensive his blindness had been. Ava, he said, one last time, and now even her name sounded like something he no longer had the right to hold. If I had seen you clearly then. She stopped him with the faintest shift of her expression. You did see me, she said. You just saw me through the size of your own ego. The sentence landed between them with no need for volume. Damien lowered his eyes because there was no defense left that would not sound childish. When he looked up again, Ava had already taken one step backward into the edge of the ballroom light, her black gown catching gold along the hem, her diamonds cold and precise at her throat. You were not wrong because I became more, she said. You were wrong because you assumed I was small. Then she turned and walked back into the room that had risen for her, leaving Damien alone in the corridor with the music and the realization that the most irreversible losses do not happen when someone leaves. They happen when you teach them exactly how little you deserve to follow. Later, under the striped awning of the Pierre, Manhattan glistened with recent rain, every black car mirrored in the wet pavement, every streetlight stretched long and amber across the night. Ava emerged wearing a camel coat over her gown, one hand holding her award case, the other adjusting the cuff at her wrist, as if the evening had cost her no more than time. Her driver stepped forward and opened the rear door. Damien had followed at a distance, not to stop her, only because he could not quite make himself return to the ballroom, where his name still glittered on donor placards while his certainty lay in pieces. He stood a few feet away beneath the hotel lights and watched her pause beside the car. For the first time since the divorce, she looked at him fully, not through him, not past him, but directly at the man he actually was. You did not lose me in that conference room, she said. You lost me the moment you decided I was a woman whose worth had to come from you. The city moved around them, indifferent and alive. Damien said nothing, because truth that exact leaves no space for performance. Ava stepped into the car, and when the door closed, it did not sound dramatic. It sounded expensive. Final. The sedan pulled away from the curb and slipped into the Manhattan night, carrying a woman richer in every way he had once failed to count, colder because warmth had learned better boundaries, and untouchable because she no longer belonged to the version of herself that had ever asked him to see her. Damien remained beneath the awning long after the taillights vanished, surrounded by marble, money, and the sharp winter air, understanding at last that regret does not always arrive as heartbreak. Sometimes it arrives as perfect clarity, and by then, the woman you underestimated is already too far gone to reach.